All right, let's talk about the architecture of arguments. Specifically, how language can be used to build a fortress around an idea, one that's almost impossible to challenge with facts or evidence. We're going to break down the linguistic tools that are sometimes used to protect an official claim from any kind of real criticism. You ever find yourself in a discussion, maybe an argument, where you just can't seem to land a punch? It feels like no matter what evidence you bring up, the other side's story just shifts and absorbs your point without a scratch. Well, you should know that feeling is probably not an accident. It's often the result of a very deliberate and pretty clever linguistic design. Okay, so let's dive right in. To really get a handle on this, we need to start with a core paradox. And it's all about when and how you apply your assumptions to the evidence you're seeing. It really all boils down to two key ideas. First, you've got what's called a priori reasoning. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying these are the beliefs you have before you ever see the evidence. For instance, an institution might start with the belief that its policies are inherently good and effective. Then, on the other hand, you have post-hoc reasoning. This is the explanation you come up with after the facts are in, especially if things didn't go the way you planned. It's like saying, yeah, we lost the game, but it's only because the sun was in our eyes. The reason comes after the result. And this is where it gets really interesting. The two ideas get mashed together into something the source material calls a structural epistemic maneuver. I know, it's a mouthful, but the tactic is pretty simple. You take your initial belief, your a priori, that our plan is good, then, when the evidence shows it actually failed, you use that same belief after the fact, post-hoc, to claim the failure somehow proves you were right all along. You literally turn a failure into validation. That's how you build a fortress around your idea. So, let's look at how this core concept gets built into some very specific linguistic traps. Now, these are arguments that sound perfectly reasonable on the surface, but when you look closer, they're designed to be completely logically airtight. I mean, come on, we've all heard this one, right? A policy gets put in place, the problem it was supposed to fix doesn't get fixed, but the defense is always that some even greater invisible catastrophe was avoided thanks to the policy. This is what's known as the Counterfactual Infallibility Trap. And its power? It all lies in that one word, counterfactual. It conjures up a hypothetical reality, right? A ghost timeline of what would have happened. And the best part? It can never, ever be proven or disproven. So here's the breakdown of how it works. The core assumption, the a priori belief, is that the baseline, what would have happened with no action, was guaranteed to be way, way worse. So when the real-world results are, meh, not so great, the argument just activates that unobservable worse outcome. And just like that, the intervention is unfalsifiable. The simple fact that total disaster didn't strike is reframed as a huge success. Okay, and that brings us right to the second trap. Have you ever noticed how the definition of success can just change over time? A huge, ambitious promise is made, and then it's slowly, quietly replaced by smaller, less ambitious goals. And each new goal is presented like it was the real plan all along. The source material identifies this one as the Mutable Goal Post protocol. It's a really effective way to keep up this illusion of consistency and success, because you're never actually failing, you're just pursuing a new, updated objective. You're just moving the goalposts. You see, the core assumption here is that success itself can just be redefined after the fact. So every time the goalposts shift, it gets framed as evolving science or, a more nuanced understanding. And what's so clever about this is that it makes anyone who points out the original failed goal look like they're stuck in the past, arguing a totally outdated point. This leads us to our last example, and honestly, this one might be the most direct of all. So what happens when your claim fails to live up to a very specific, established definition? Well, you don't back down from the claim, you just change the definition. And this technique is called the semantic redefinition loop. It's brilliant in a way. Instead of changing your claim to fit reality, you change the very words we use to describe reality so that they end up fitting your claim. And here's the play-by-play. The core belief is that fundamental definitions can be updated on the fly, mid-crisis. So when a product fails to meet the original definition, like, say, providing immunity, the word itself gets a little makeover. It's redefined to mean something less, like maybe just producing an immune response. Then, this whole shift is presented as scientific progress, which makes it logically impossible for the original claim to have ever failed in the first place. Now, it's really important to get this. These traps don't just exist in a vacuum. They often link together, one after another, creating what the source calls a cascade of capture, a process that just slowly and systematically shuts down any and all room for legitimate debate. And this whole thing tends to unfold in stages. It actually starts pre-crisis by embedding these assumptions deep inside policy. Then, in an early crisis, the first traps are sprung to establish authority. Mid-crisis, they're fully activated to reframe failures as big successes. In a late crisis, they're used to neutralize any reports of harm. And finally, post-crisis, the entire sequence is wrapped up with a bow and presented as science working exactly as intended. The loop is closed. The narrative is now impenetrable. So, the big question is, how in the world do you navigate a conversation when these kinds of traps are being thrown at you? Well, the good news is there's a proposed framework for dismantling this exact kind of rhetoric. Here are the key takeaways for cutting through all that noise. First, you have to target the hidden premises. Always ask, okay, what has to be true for this claim to actually hold up? Second, demand the raw data, not just the polished summary they want you to see. Third, just flat out reject arguments that are based on hypotheticals. That whole "it would have been worse" defense. Fourth, call it out. Name the trap when you see it in action. And finally, defend the process of science itself, which is all about questioning and trying to prove things wrong, not just blindly defending one particular narrative. And all of this leaves us with one last pretty provocative question to think about. Is the real goal of skepticism to protect a specific set of conclusions, a narrative, or is it to protect the open, the rigorous, and, the often uncomfortable process of questioning itself? It's a really fundamental distinction that I think gets right to the heart of what it means to actually search for the truth.